Is it a pleasure today to be able to share our Bima with Rabbi Richard Levy. Rabbi Levy is a leader in the Reform movement both here in Los Angeles but also nationally, but beyond just the Reform movement. Throughout liberal Judaism, through so many of my colleagues in the conservative Reform, Reconstructionist, renewal movements, perhaps even in the Orthodox world as well, this I cannot answer. Rabbi Levy is known for his graciousness and gentleness of spirit, but also for his wit, his wisdom, and his insight. And it is always a pleasure to be able to share and have him share with us words of Torah. There he is.
And it's a pleasure to share this bima with the Pine family, known for years for their strong, courageous stances in the community. You are appropriately named, Ari, as a lion. Thank you for your words this morning. For all of you who were in shul on Rosh Hashanah, today's Torah portion has sounded very familiar. Vayera ends with Genesis 21, the first day's portion, and Genesis 22, the second day's portion. The two chapters describe the birth of Isaac to Abraham and Sarah, Abraham's expulsion at Sarah's request of Hagar and Ishmael, and Abraham's binding of Isaac. On Rosh Hashanah, these portions stand alone, emphasizing the beginning of the Jewish people at the beginning of the year. But today, these two portions are put in a different context, a context that begins in Genesis 18 and 19 with the arrival of angels who will preside over the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. What is the relationship of these two wicked cities to our Rosh Hashanah readings? The first clue, I think, is in the name of the parasha itself, Vayera, and there appeared. Part of the opening sentence, and Adonai appeared. On Rosh Hashanah, we read of God's appearance to Abraham and Sarah, first securing the lineage of the Jewish people, then announcing that Abraham and Sarah deserved to begin that lineage by agreeing to God's shocking request for the binding of Isaac. We generally think that this portion provides a contrast between our righteous first family, Abraham, Sarah, and Isaac, and the wicked families of the cities where Abraham's nephew Lot chose to live, Sodom and Gomorrah. But perhaps it's not so simple. The angels clothed as men who visit Abraham and Sarah and later Lot seem to be looking to see whether these individuals practice, as you've heard already, the essential mitzvah of hachnasat orchim, the welcoming of guests. Certainly, Abraham and Sarah pass the test. They offer their guests a hearty meal. Lot also welcomes them, but the men of Sodom and Gomorrah almost knock down Lot's doors in an attempt to rape his visitors. The men of Sodom obviously fail the hospitality test. Lot is saved, Abraham and Sarah are saved, the inhabitants of Sodom and Gomorrah are destroyed. Why is hospitality, hachnasat orchim, such a life or death mitzvah? Perhaps because in the desert it is a question of life or death. If one does not take in a desert traveler, that person may well die of starvation or thirst. To this day, this mitzvah is one of those to which the Talmud tells us there is no limit. While the Talmud elucidates other crimes of the Sodom residents, punishing those who help the poor, for example, in the Torah, the denial of hospitality is sufficient to bestow a punishment of death on those who condemn desert travelers to death. But there is a catch to this black and white contrast of Abraham and Sarah with the men of Sodom and Gomorrah. Near the end of today's portion, in the chapter we read on the first day of Rosh Hashanah, there is a disturbing story. Sarah, having been assured of a child of her own, is irritated by Ishmael's behavior and asks Abraham to cast him and Hagar out of the house to make sure there is no confusion as to which son will inherit the covenant with God. Abraham, disturbed at this request, asks God's counsel and is told to hearken to Sarah's voice, which the rabbis understand to be a sign that Sarah had a prophetic voice, superior, they argued, to Abraham's. But wouldn't this be a violation of Hachnasat Orchim? Why can Abraham and Sarah get away with this and indeed be encouraged by God to do it? The answer tells us something about the mitzvah of welcoming guests. If you recall the story, Abraham gives Hagar and Ishmael a water container and provisions for the journey, but the provisions run out in the wilderness. It is God who opens Hagar's eyes to a well of water near her, with which she fills the container Abraham gave her, and thus saves the lives of both her and Ishmael. God is the ultimate machnis orchim, the ultimate provider of hospitality. God created a world with water and food to help humans and animals survive. In the world which is our individual home, we are to emulate God, except when taking someone into our house will get in the way of others of God's priorities. One of those priorities is securing the destiny of the Jewish people and other peoples. God created many nations. That's what the first 11 chapters of Genesis are about. As God separated light from darkness, dry land from water, woman from the man-woman, so God separated nations and languages one from the other. It looked at first as though Isaac and Ishmael, who became the Jews and the Arabs, could live in the same house. Early on, it became clear that they could not. And so God created a special destiny for Ishmael and his descendants. As God separated dry land from water, so God asked Abraham to separate Ishmael and his mother Hagar from his household. Abraham provided them with some food and a water container, and God provided the water to fill it. Being hospitable to guests cannot result in inhibiting the development of a people. Abraham, against his will, needs to let Hagar and Ishmael develop a destiny of their own. That the expulsion of Hagar and Ishmael appears in the same parashah as the binding of Isaac is also instructive. When Abraham says, "Hineni, here I am," and Isaac walks loyally at Abraham's side, we are told that the binding of Isaac is a kind of initiation rite into the destiny that will be Isaac's and that of the Jewish people. Ishmael endures a similar rite of initiation. Isaac is threatened with death by sacrifice, Ishmael with death by exposure. Their parallel stories reinforce the Torah's insistence that God looks out for both their peoples and cares about both of their destinies. God also desires that they live in peace with each other. We learn very little about what happens to Ishmael after he and his mother leave home. He and Isaac meet once to bury Abraham and then go their separate ways. The Torah does not tell us about Ishmael's life after this, as it does not tell us about Esau's life once he leaves home to discover his destiny. Those stories are between them and God. This story has often been used as a parable about the relations between Jews and Palestinians. For them both to live on the same land in the same house would be to compromise the identity of each of them. Isaac and Ishmael each needs the space to develop their own culture, their own nation, in peace and security, with protection from the raging men of Sodom. In short, Jewish tradition does not condemn Abraham and Sarah for sending Hagar and Ishmael away. In some ways, we reenact the story of sending out Hagar and Ishmael, every time we send a child off to college, off to their own apartment, off to a new city for their first job. We hope we are not sending them off into a wilderness, and we give them a lot of provisions and water bottles. But in the end, this act is one of trust, that God will show them the wells with which to fill the bottles we have given them, wells that contain the substance that will shape their lives. It is also an act of trust that other parents will have provided models of loving homes as well, so that wicked people will not pound on their doors to violate the fragile new identities they are creating there. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah is a warning of how important it is to establish models for hospitality, for welcoming, for seeing the home as a place of safety and nurture. We often see the Sodom and Gomorrah story in the light of Abraham's arguing to save the cities for ultimately the sake of 10 innocents who lived there. His arguing was brave, noble, but in the end futile, because the culture of wickedness was so strong that there were not even 10 righteous people within the cities. His effort to save the wicked cities should have started years before. Had he visited his nephew, he would have seen how wicked were his neighbors, and he might have asked God how he and Lot could help them do tshuva. This week's portion challenges us to ask, are we doing all we can to ensure that Sodom and Gomorrah do not develop within our cities? Are we modeling hospitality to strangers, concern for the poor, respect for different identities and cultures? Are we acting out our role to manifest the presence of God in our midst? Vayera, and God appeared, through angels, through acts of faith, through acts of destruction. How will we respond when God appears in the guise of a stranger needing food and water? Will we be able to say, Vayera banu, God appears through us? Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.